Hello. During today's training, we will be reviewing the self-assessment validations and remediation transition plan for the Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule. We will be discussing HCBS assessments. I will be providing an overview of the validation forms as well as the remediation transition plans, and we will be discussing the service provider responsibilities. The Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule is designed to ensure that service providers provide individuals with developmental disabilities, person-centered services, full access to the benefits of community living, and long-term services and supports in the most integrated setting of their choosing. In summary, the final rule ensures that individuals are provided with choices, rights, opportunities, and integration. The deadline for service providers to come into compliance with the final rule is March 17, 2023. In the summer of 2020, DDS released the Service Provider Self-Assessment. Service providers under Attachment A, a list of service codes, where we were asked to complete the self-assessment with input from individuals served. In the spring and summer of 2021, DDS contracted with Public Consulting Group to do a virtual site assessment for about 1,200 service providers across California. Approximately 45 of those were in ELARC's catchment area. The virtual site assessment consisted of a walkthrough of the facility, interview with staff, and interview with individuals served. For copies of the site assessment questions, you can visit the ELARC and DDS website. As we move forward with compliance with the final rule, service providers who completed a self-assessment must now validate their self-assessment if they reported to be in compliance with all federal requirements. Providers who did not receive a virtual site assessment but reported to be in compliance are to submit existing evidence supporting their compliance status. Each provider must complete either the non-residential or residential validation templates, enclosures 2A and or 2B, and return them to ELARC at communityservices@elarc.org no later than June 30th, 2022. Enclosure 2A is for non-residential providers, and enclosure 2B is for residential providers. Please note that the department has asked that providers do not submit documents with individual identifiable information, that they do not submit entire program designs or policy procedures. Only submit the pages that are applicable as evidence of compliance, and a provider must complete a separate form for each service or vendor number which they operate. The validation forms will require that service providers under each federal requirement that they identify to be out of compliance submit supporting documentation. The department has provided examples of supporting documents that can be submitted under each federal requirement. Please review the required documents or the suggested documents that are required by the department and submit those applicable sections of the program design and or other documents to ELARC. For service providers who are non-residential, you will need to submit or validate your self-assessment for requirements 1 through 5. For residential providers, you will need to submit supporting documents or validate your responses for requirements 1 through 10. Again, this is to validate requirements in which you identify to be in compliance per your self-assessment. For providers who reported not to be fully in compliant in their self-assessment or who were determined to not fully meet the requirements through the virtual site assessment conducted by PCG, you are required to submit a remediation plan for each out of compliance area. Providers requiring a remediation plan must complete either the non-residential or residential remediation template form. These are enclosures 4A and 4B, and return them to ELARC at communityservices@elarc.org within 45 days of receipt from the regional center, but no later than July 22nd, 2022. Enclosure 4A is for non-residential providers, and enclosure 4B is for residential providers. Again, a separate form is required for each service and/or vendor program which you operate. Please read the instructions carefully and identify whether your setting meets the requirements, and if it does not, please provide a summary and supporting documents of how your setting will meet the requirements by March of 2023. A response for every out-of-compliance area is required under each federal requirement. For non-residential providers, please submit supporting documents and a response under the remediation plan for requirements 1 through 5 that are out of compliance, and for residential providers, requirements 1 through 10. Some service providers may need to resubmit both a validation document and remediation plan, as some items may be in compliance as reported in your self-assessment. However, others may not be in compliance, and therefore a remediation plan will be required. In addition to submitting the validation and/or remediation forms along with their supporting documents, service providers must also complete the program design addendum, or enclosure 5A and B. The addendum is to, providers are to describe in detail under each requirement how their program is in compliance or will be in compliance with each of the applicable federal requirements. Again, non-residential providers are to complete an addendum for federal requirements 1 through 5, and residential providers are to complete an addendum for requirements 1 through 10. To summarize, for the validations, service providers are to submit the validation template, either enclosure 2A or 2B, along with supporting documents and their program design addendum, no later than June 30th, 2022. Remember, providers must complete a separate form for each service and/or vendor number which they operate. Documents are to be submitted to communityservices@elarc.org. For remediation plans, providers are to submit the remediation plan template or enclosures 4A or 4B, along with their supporting documents and the program design addendum to communityservices@elarc.org no later than July 22nd, 2022. A separate form is required for each service or vendor program which you operate. A reminder that some service providers may need to submit both the validation and remediation plan. If you have any questions during this process, you may contact the Community Services Department at communityservices@elarc.org. For additional information regarding HCBS, you may visit the ELARC or DDS website. Here you will find relevant training along with instructional materials and frequently asked questions. Thank you.